So we've got the wonderful Jack Symonds with us today. We've just started rehearsing his piece for the first time with him. We first met you back at Adelaide Festival last year, 2021, and we were blown away by the piece we played of yours, Bluin, wasn't it? Yeah. And we just thought we need to commission this guy. So can you tell us, I think we all met you that day. Is that right? None of us had met before.
No, that's right.
You'd met me, but I don't count, it's fine.
But maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself. And we know you're from Sydney, and basically that's it.
Yeah. Well, yes, I am the composer of this piece, and it was a huge pleasure to work on that piece for sextet, piano and voice last year at Adelaide Festival. Most of what I work in, actually, I have an opera company in Sydney Chamber Opera, and so most of what I do is actually working with singers, but in the context of a chamber opera. So one player per part, one singer per part, very much the idea of individual responsibility and a kind of intensity that comes with making something small scale. And so it's always wonderful to find like-minded people in chamber music who do that. And working with you guys last year really showed me, it was wonderful to see people instantly sort of get on board with what I'm trying to do in music, which is sometimes pushes people to their virtuosic limits. And to see people grapple with that and take it on as individuals as part of a group was immensely satisfying.
I found one of the most satisfying aspects of working with you at that festival was that we were not only playing your music, but you were a collaborator in that on that piece. You were playing the piano and conducting and working with us and sort of guiding us through it, which really gave us the opportunity to get to know you as a musician as well as a composer. And I think that was one of the things that struck us most, when we were talking about commissioning and who we wanted to approach. Well, we have a relationship with this guy, and we respect you as a musician deeply. And but I'm just wondering, when you get a commission like this, how much of our personalities, or how much of knowing the ASQ as these four members, did that enter into your mind when you were composing?
Well, quite a bit. There's a few answers to that. There's quite a lot, especially having worked with a group and seeing the dynamic and seeing those unspoken things in chamber music. Seeing the way people adjust to each other, seeing the way people non-verbally criticize each other as well. Watching that in a small ensemble, it all feeds into, sometimes intangibly, into making a piece, whether it's small or large. And so it was, had I not worked with and known you last year, the piece would have turned out very differently. It allowed me to go in different directions with also what I'd listened to in people's sounds, people's registers, and even in the interaction of counterpoint sometimes. When I heard you play other repertoire, when I heard you play such varied things as Schoenberg and Alfred Hill, listening to the way that the quartet dealt with what four string players playing together even means, feeds into making a quartet. And there are, names are enshrined in the quartet. Everybody gets an oblique reference in their name to a piece of music, which is my little challenge to myself, to hide those little Easter eggs in a piece, and don't reveal it until the rehearsal, so the players have something to grasp onto. And when it's that moment of meeting the composer working on a piece, when there's something to break the ice. But the corporate sound of ASQ as well is something that was in my mind. And then hearing you again a couple of months ago, well after the piece was finished, really it was great to know that I'd made something that I knew that your sound would be able to encompass and would also stretch you in different directions.
Thank you. Well, I would say that the piece feels like it was written for us somehow, wouldn't you say? Like it feels like it fits like a glove, and we've had a tremendous time working on it, and I just think that there's so much of the effort you poured into this work was sort of born out of our time last year together at the Adelaide Festival. So thank you. Yeah.
It's pretty special because actually you met us when we were at our infancy. It was Chris's very beginning.
Before even I'd accepted the job.
That's right, and that was part of the interest of it, is seeing someone who was new to the sound finding their way and joining in. And there are lots of passages for the viola in this quartet where the viola actually, I realised only after I composed it, when the viola tries to find a way into the rest of the trio.
Have you found your way?
I love it.
Which just feels so considered, doesn't it? I vividly remember first getting the score and when we first played it, and there was just a essentialness to getting it right, because it just felt like there were bits of this thing that once there was something greater than once it's all locked in, then there was this magic. Which is, I know it sounds a bit coy, but there was this sense of cogs that were vital. You couldn't lose any of them. And once you found them, then there was just this mechanism that just sort of spun out into this amazing thread. Where do you even start when you go, okay, I've got this commission, and you know us, and is it a blank canvas, or is there already things that are sort of brimming that you go, well, these have to go in?
I'd like to say start at bar one and you 44 pages later say it's the end of the day, but it doesn't quite happen like that. With this work, I knew that I knew the shape I wanted to make. I knew I wanted to make a work in two movements where the movements each couldn't exist on their own. And making a two-movement piece is actually, there's not a lot of precedent for it. The pieces in two movements before recent times are very rare, and the two movements stand in a strange relationship to each other, often sort of codependent, or sometimes unsuccessfully, that they just seem like two utterly different pieces that haven't been thought of as a unity. But in this piece, I wanted to make sure that the two big parts of this piece each had great instabilities in them to make sure that we needed the other part. I'm very attracted to unstable things in all art, and to a point when it's, trying to prop up a match on a toothpick or something. And I love the idea in music that because it exists in time, and because time only moves forward in one direction, that how you deal with that can be either very confirming of melodies or ideas in music or whatever, or it can completely contradict them. And I love the idea of making music where it's almost like I plant within the music something that will inevitably engineer its own destruction. So each of these two movements is essentially made of smaller sections and smaller ideas that there's something wrong with them, that it's like I shouldn't have composed it that way. A good composition would eliminate these errors and make it a smooth unbumpy ride throughout the journey of the piece to get from A to B. But I'm very interested in music where the instabilities inherent in an idea are brought to the surface, and they eventually get so acute that the piece has to stop or take a new direction. To make a piece like that, I had to map out both where I wanted, what I wanted the material to be, and then where I wanted it to falter, and then how I wanted to start again. So it's having those three processes and sort of laying it all out and knowing how it fitted into a span of 20-ish minutes. That's how it starts. But really, the whole piece could be summarized in the first bar, because the violin plays a scale that goes upwards. It actually, all of the notes in that scale, all of the gaps in between the notes, all the intervals in that scale, most of the piece is made out of in a huge linear way. So something that I hear of as like a little key to unlocking a piece later opens out into all of it. I look at all of its possibilities like under the microscope or in a big blown out way as well, or in a very expressive way or in a very mechanistic way or a violent way or a tend way. All the different affects that can be contained within quite an initially emotionless piece of musical DNA. That's often how I start a larger scale piece, to look at one thing in every way I can think of it and find new things I didn't consider.
This piece was obviously commissioned by us to be premiered first in London in the Quartetthaus, a small structure that's custom made for a string quartet in the round, with 52 people around it. It's very intimate, very small.
I think no one's more than 2 meters or something from
any performer. Yeah, it's an incredible space, which I believe you've been in before. How much did the setting of that premiere come into your thinking with how you were writing the piece, or not at all?
It certainly influenced some of the ways that the parts interact, because sometimes in a very large space, if you have very detailed part interaction in even a small scale piece that's relatively clear like a string quartet, it can get lost, or it becomes a bit more generalized as a wash. But actually when I saw the Quartetthaus in 2015 Melbourne Festival, I was struck by the fact that details that I thought I took for granted in repertoire string quartets were vividly sharpened, and things I'd never heard before were revealed, and also watching the players have to watch each other. They had no choice. They couldn't watch anything else but like the person sitting opposite them. Watching that different dynamic to a more traditional concert presentation meant that somehow it felt that the intensity of the experience of the material simultaneously, and that has directly come from watching and experiencing Quartetthaus. And as a composer, you always go into a venue and say, "Oh, what music would I make in this space?" Sometimes quite inappropriately. But here, the memory of it, even though I haven't been in there for that whole 7 years or whatever, the memory of that space of hearing music I thought I knew revealed differently really changed it. And so I think, in a way, with this piece, I tried to push myself to I think I know, you work on something for enough months and you know your own material very well, and I know my own music very well, that I start to think, well, what if I was myself in a Quartetthaus? Would I want to reveal new things about the piece in that way. And so there are certain avenues the piece takes that wouldn't necessarily have been taken so far had it not been for the initial setting of the Quartetthaus. Yeah.
So we're going to have to practice staring into
Yeah,
other's eyes.
The quartet genre is a titan for composers. Do you feel, I mean, you've written a string quartet before, like, how do you feel about writing for string quartet?
Well, I think you can either be overawed by it or you can take on the challenge. I suppose composers aren't unaware of how, you have to really do your best work in the quartet medium, as everyone has. I guess I prefer to look at the quartet medium as, and looking at much older quartets and things that I love, string quartets that I love, are works that aren't necessarily like bent over backwards in service of some kind of received tradition. Or, on the other hand, they're pieces that are so extremely in awe of this tradition that they push their composers into absolutely new places they hadn't gone before. There are especially 6 works around the turn of the 20th century that I find are like huge journeys that forced their composers to write in a new way. The single quartets by Franck and Magnard, the 2 French ones, and then Schoenberg's first quartet, and Zemlinsky's second quartet, then Enescu's first quartet, and Bloch's first quartet. All of those I think are extraordinary. They're big 40-minute plus huge extravaganzas, but they take on the extremity of late Beethoven, but they force their composers to think anew about what it means to write music. And I find that very moving, as well as composers and pieces where it's almost as if the composers are just playing with the sounds that 4-string instruments can make, or are totally unaware of the tradition, like the quartets of Szymanowski or Janacek, where you feel that they're not, they couldn't give a damn about what Beethoven did. This is a sound they wanted to make with 4-string instruments. And I think balancing those 2 extremes of quartet writing is that's sort of what happened in the rest of the history of quartet writing. And as much as I love lots of this music, it's ultimately I find material that I find interesting, and I know what will suit for what I want. I'm the first audience member of my piece, and I know what I want to hear in a quartet that maybe strikes a balance between those 2 extremes of being hyper aware of just what string quartet is, and then playing with the possibilities of what the sound of 4 instruments and colours can actually just do in a room, regardless of who else has done it.
Did you ever play a stringed instrument yourself?
No, never. Absolutely never. I can't do anything.
That is entirely not true.
Except everything else.
It's remarkable because
it is,
you
isn't it?
write so well for string instruments, and you're obviously extremely familiar with the string quartet repertoire, but yet you still find a new and fresh perspective in your writing, which I think is we've all really. We've had a great time discovering and getting our heads around some of these incredible sound worlds that you achieve. The opening of the second part, for instance, with these kind of these sliding glissandi, it's extremely eerie and extremely evocative. And I just think, there's just so many great moments, and you think, wow, I've actually never heard that before.
1, 2.
How did you come to understand string writing? I mean, is it just through working with musicians, through working with players over the years? And
That's primarily it's watching what's hard and easy in rehearsals of chamber music. Working with like as a pianist, working with lots of string players, playing lots of string and piano music, but also looking at what's on the page for repertoire pieces, and then hearing in live performance as opposed to recording what actually eventuates. Because there's so many pieces where you hear a perfect recording and you think really, and then you see it live and you know all the things that have been very difficult, or even if difficulty is one thing, but that are unidiomatic and that are so risky as to almost be not worth it. And so, I'm very attracted to virtuosity as well, and so it's like you have to always be careful that like just because something's hard doesn't make it good, just as something is easy doesn't make it good or bad. But the difficulty should be commensurate to the reward sometimes. And having played a lot of new music on the piano, there's so much I've found that the rewards are not always commensurate to the sheer amount of notes one has to play, or the detail, mastering some enormous detail that just goes by in a second and it's not integral to the expression. So I guess I'm writing something, I'm always aware, like, if I were to play this, would I be really annoyed at having to learn this detail? And hopefully not for me, I can't ever answer anybody else, but that's always my thought to myself. If I'm writing something that I know is very difficult to perform, or to conceive, or to get together as an ensemble, like, what's the point of this, making something like this, and unless it's really what I want to hear, and it's really the most practical way of notating or thinking about this idea.
Yeah.
So I keep on smiling to myself because there's a lot. I mean, there's been a lot. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot of virtuosity. There's been a lot of digging and searching and trying to understand, on a very, very kind of academic level, especially for me with rhythms and all this stuff. And it's not just the sense of satisfaction of I achieved what's on the page. There's the added rush of, geez, that really works, and that's really enjoyable, and that was the overwhelming feeling in the room when we first, after we'd spent hours on our when we first came to go. So there's no reading this through off the score. After we get it delivered, after the hours of individual work coming together in the room, just going, that feels right, that makes sense, that's come together, that's worth it, not just the intellectual exercise of practicing something and then achieving it, but that achievement is something really special.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, a quartet is so much more than some of its parts, and so if it is just practicing your part and coming together, it is unsatisfying as chamber music to just do that, to just be, a collection of four people who happen to be able to play together.
Yeah. So after we take this to London, we'll be taking it across the country here in Australia, and we won't have Quartetthaus as our setting to play it in. We'll be playing it in bigger spaces, lots of varied spaces across the country. What advice would you give to listeners who are listening to this piece for the first time? Like, how can someone approach this with clean ears, or the ears that you'd want listening to this piece?
I think with any new piece of music, it should be an openness to take the composer at their word, and to trust that the composer hopefully knows where they're going on with the time they're allotted. The fact that 20 minutes on the clock is the same all the time. 20 minutes of time is exactly the same on the clock everywhere, but what you do with it and the perception of time that someone listening to it can achieve, that is what the composer can play with, and the performers, of course, but that's what the composer has carved out of 20 minutes of your time. So try and go with me in following the idea that every piece of musical information could at any moment either blossom into something large and voluptuous, or be totally undermined and taken in a new way. And the quartet only does those two things. I tried to make sure that like there were only those two states. And so if someone comes to it, if someone's listening to it, just think, I wonder whether what I'm hearing is going to eventuate into something that is either satisfies my desire for what's going to happen, or completely stymies it and shows me something new. And that's all we can really do.
Thank you so much for coming and joining us in our rehearsal process too. Ideally, you would get the opportunity to work with the musicians you're writing for, but it's not always the case. Sometimes composers will be commissioned to work and they don't, get to have that interaction. How does that change the process for you?
Does it make you feel better or worse?
Yeah. Infinitely better. I think it's the fact that a string quartet is such a special thing. It's not just a scratch band of a chamber orchestra or a chamber ensemble. It's for piccolo double bass and tuba that doesn't have any music written for it. It's actually an established group where there are lots of things that taking a new work on for the first time doesn't even need to be said. There are established ensemble colours and ideas and standards and ways of working that accelerate the way that a piece comes to life. So therefore, I can write things that test those ways of working to a higher degree. And knowing that I can be there makes a big difference too, because I know that small details are going to be important to a string quartet as they wouldn't be to a much larger group. But yeah, I like to be in control of a lot of my music. I perform a lot of it, and being able to hand it over to other people is actually just both a joy and sometimes a relief to actually listen to it outside. As fun as it is to play one's own music sometimes, it's actually quite relieving and almost pleasurable to listen to it.
Day one of working together. Is it a relief? Was it pleasurable?
Certainly. Both. The fact that we can, on day one we can get through the whole piece, and at some point every bar has been right. That's very good.
At some point, there's room for improvement.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's clear how the map of where to go, and it's very heartening for a composer to know that I can just tell that things that, had it been much earlier in a process or had been people who hadn't put the time into it, there would have been stops all the time to being, oh, what is that? Who's got that? What's happening in the music? But there were whole pages when I just knew that what I'd put on the score had been not only just performed, but inflected and interpreted to make a shape that could get from beginning to end and had a reason for existing. And there's nothing more validating for a composer than that, when you don't have to say something to anybody and then they can take this blueprint that you provide them and make it into something that has a reason for existing in time, the one dimension that a score doesn't have.
I mean, that goes both ways though. It's the same with us, that we played pages of it and just knew that there was this thing there about it, and so the time and effort and the hours of poring over it and sorting out how to line things up, and it is all pleasurable. It's really all been, and I mean, most of it. Some of it has been extremely like frustrating when you work on it and then you come back to it the next day and it's not quite settled or it's not quite congealed. That's a bad word, but you know, but most of the time it's just so satisfying.
And it's never felt insurmountable.
No.
Yes, it's
as extraordinarily difficult as it is.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like it's beyond us. I mean, it is beyond us at that point, but there's this drive to get it right, and that is because of the brilliant writing. No, it's just a compliment.
You even made Dale get out his ruler, which I don't think he's done before.
Wow. Yeah. He usually smacks us with it. Do it again. Yeah.
It was the only way I could figure out those fives against sixes.
Yeah.
I did get a calculator out at one point trying to work out like a metric thing, but it actually was very simple in the end.
I'm really grateful that this is the point in our process that you've arrived, not any sooner. You don't need to hear some of our rehearsals with the metronome and some of those discussions, but this has just been so much fun.
Well, thanks again, Jack. It's an absolute privilege, and we're very excited to take this show on the road, as they say.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.